So, as furries, we have a lot of fun little ways that we interact with each other in the context of the furry fandom. Most of them stem from the idea that as furries, we are portraying our personas or characters that are anthropomorphic animals, or animals with human-like features. We've talked on this channel at length about how our anthro-animal selves act as our identity in the fandom, but some of the most fascinating ways that we interact with each other come when we as humans simulate some of the traits of our animal-based anthro characters. And one trait that has been fascinating me recently is that furries like to be talked to like pets? Now I know that's quite the loaded statement there, and there are a lot of things that we can explore in that area, some that we probably can't do here on YouTube. But I'm talking specifically about how furries really respond to the same special treatment that we tend to give our pets as members of our respective families. And there's no better example of this than being called a good boy or a good girl. I don't know, there really is something special about being called a good boy in the context of this fandom specifically, and it happens all the time in normal conversation amongst us furries. But at the same time, we're not pets. We're not owned by one another in the fandom, and our social dynamic is much more human than that. So what is it about being called a good boy or a good girl that really makes us feel all good inside? Well, after doing maybe too much research into this, the answers all come back to the very same reason why many of us end up becoming furries and joining the fandom in the first place. Let me explain. Anytime I do a deep dive into the intricacies of furry fandom behavior, I always love taking a step back out of the furry bubble that I spend too much time in and simply calling things how they are. This is pretty weird. Not just being a furry in general, but the fact that we call each other good boy and good girl in the first place, and the fact that it works. But to me, that's awesome. The furry fandom is one of the few communities where being weird is celebrated. And I'm not talking about the weird that's palatable. I'm talking calling your best friend good boys and girls and them feeling good inside weird. And honestly, if that's too weird for you, that's totally fine. There are many other wonderful videos on the site to help keep you entertained. But if you're not, and if you like deep dives on how weird this fandom is, feel free to hit that subscribe button for more weird breakdowns of what makes this furry fandom tick. But anyway, this is yet another weird thing that we furries tend to get up to, but it takes a special type of uniqueness for this one because of the social dynamic that it puts us in. Of course, creating personas or characters that are humans that take on animalistic traits is the cornerstone of this community. But things always get interesting when we as humans start to take on a little bit of the anthropomorphic responsibility ourselves. Because at the end of the day, we can only do so much, right? We can't sprout wings or grow a tail or anything like that. We are more or less stuck with the human hardware that we're born with. So when we as humans take on the task of anthropomorphism, we typically show it in our behaviors, especially amongst one another. Now, a lot of this ends up being pretty surface level, like animal noise imitation, like barking, or in my case, purring, like this. But sometimes it goes a bit deeper, to the point where taking on these social relationship roles of animal interaction can give some furries a sense of identity as well. But that's my question. Why is that? Obviously, things get pretty interesting when we as humans take on the abstract idea of animal anthropomorphism and try to act it out on our own. But what is it about these two simple words, good boy, that gets us to act up so much? And trust me, it's not just an act. We're not playing it up for the sake of making the other person feel good. There is a real, tangible, calculable response that many furries have when being called a good boy or a good girl. In fact, it's such a real thing that when you take a deeper look into what doing something that simple does to so many people in this community, we start to get into some of the deeper psychological and social dynamics that come into play in the context of the furry fandom, which is where, in my opinion, how this fandom works goes from simply weird to utterly fascinating. And as we look into why being called a good boy works, I think you'll start to understand why. Now, I did a lot of research on this particular furry phenomenon, and while there were a lot of asides that were fun to dig into, when summarizing what I saw, there were 4 main points as to why being called a good boy or a good girl actually means something to us furries. And we'll start with an idea that I've been preaching about since I started this channel. Being called a good boy is an affirmation of identity. For many furries, creating a persona or adopting an anthro-animal character allows for the exploration and expression of aspects of their identity that can't easily be conveyed in everyday life. Probably the biggest example of this is the large LGBTQ+ population in the fandom, and how this is one of the few spaces in their lives where they can express that part of themselves freely. But that same idea can also be used when talking about personas as our identity. The concept of a persona gives us an extremely rare opportunity to fully define how we want to be perceived in the furry fandom space. This is why a lot of us prefer our persona name over our real name and act as our personas instead of our real selves. All of that goes back to this idea that our persona is who we want to be known as in the fandom. So when our persona, which again is who we are in the fandom, is given the label good boy or good girl, that reinforces the concept of self and provides a sense of authenticity. In other words, those two words are short for I acknowledge who you are as your persona, and who you are is good. The second reason works off similar ideas of the first one, but it's a bit more specific, insofar that being called a good boy gives furries emotional validation. It sounds simple because, in all honesty, it kinda is, but being acknowledged as a good boy offers a sense of positive reinforcement, which in turn fosters feelings of acceptance and belonging. This takes on a heightened importance in this community in particular, where the fandom acts as a haven for people who may experience social marginalization or a lack of validation in other areas in their life. And I do want to stress that we need validation, external validation in particular. It's not egotistical to want to be seen as someone who simply exists in the world and be let know that their existence is not a waste of space or time. Forget being a furry, that's just a basic human trait, which is why so many of us who may not get that elsewhere come to the fandom for it. And hey, this fandom is more than happy to give it. We just do it in our own special way. But whether it's you matter or good boy, affirming language enhances the emotional well-being for so many of us in this community. Now, taking a step back and looking at what this behavior does to the fandom at large, there is a sense of community bonding when we endorse each other as good boys and good girls. This idea takes the individual sense of self-identity and applies it to the fandom as a whole. These affectionate terms strengthen the social bonds within the community itself, which might sound kind of funny, but as silly as these words may be, they actually hold a lot of weight and function as terms of endearment that convey mutual respect and camaraderie. Basically, it makes you feel like you are part of the in-crowd that is comfortable calling each other good boys, and that is essential for maintaining the close-knit nature of this fandom. And I know that's kind of confusing, but this actually makes a lot more sense if I think about it in the opposite direction. Let's say, my boss was looking at a pull request that I have for work, and instead of commenting looks good to me, he commented good boy on the pull request. I'll be honest, I'd be a bit weirded out. That's just not the relationship I have with them, and my job is definitely not the right community to be using that language. But that's what makes this fandom so special. Not only is that type of language simply normal and accepted, but it actually means something special to those both giving and receiving it. And again, our weirdness is a hallmark feature of the fandom as a whole. Finally, and I wasn't really expecting this one, but it makes sense the more I looked into it. But when furries call each other good boys, it actually allows for the safe exploration of power dynamics. Now, we're gonna stay very, very surface level when talking about this, but this actually leads us down the path of using the same language that we do with our pets that I was alluding to earlier. And I'm sure there are other channels that can get into more deeper explorations of this for you if you're interested. But it is true, for some, that expression allows for the exploration of power dynamics in a controlled and consensual manner. Being called a good boy or a good girl can evoke a sense of nurturance and care, similar but distinct emotions from the validation that we were talking about earlier. And when done in the relative comfort that members of the furry community can provide, this enables individuals an avenue to navigate the complex aspects of their personality and identity, particularly when it comes to the sense of being a caregiver or being cared for. That's an opportunity that isn't readily available to explore, and it may be something that someone is not comfortable looking into without being in the headspace of their anthro-animal character or persona. But it is significant enough to call out and still adds to the overall sense of validation that these terms provide to members of the fandom. So if you're like me, you're probably a little bit surprised at just how much goes into these two seemingly simple words, good boy. But just like many things in the furry fandom, even these seemingly simple gestures can mean quite a lot. Being called a good boy or a good girl is a multifaceted experience, encompassing identity affirmation, emotional validation, community bonding, and even an opportunity to explore interpersonal dynamics in a safe environment. In other words, these expressions contribute to the supportive and inclusive atmosphere that characterizes the furry fandom as a whole. And it's weird stuff like this is why I'm a furry in the first place and I have this channel in the first place. I don't know about you, but I find it so fascinating how seriously we take this animal with human traits thing. It's a deep thing for so many people in this fandom. So deep in fact that going up to them, patting them on the head and calling them a good boy really means something to them. All right, that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. I'll catch you in the next one, but until then, stay wild out there. Peace.